I'm very, very excited about this particular conversation. I have conversations with people every single day. I get paid to talk to people. Isn't that fun? Incredibly privileged and honored, all of us here, to have with us today Google's Chief Internet Evangelist, Vint Cerf, on his first visit to Africa in his capacity, in his Google capacity. He's served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google since October 2005, and he's really responsible for identifying new enabling technologies to support the development of advanced internet-based products and services from Google. Even I, who's a complete technophobe, know that he is one of the world's fathers of the internet. Please welcome to the stage, Vint Cerf. Pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Siki, before you start with the first question, I'd like to take advantage of the fact that I've got this stage here. I have a few very brief things that I want to share with everybody, points that I think are very important, some of which were repeated this morning, and I want to emphasize them. But I also want to tell you that my first visit to Johannesburg was in 1974, and my purpose in that visit was to demonstrate the ARPANET. As the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. It was started in 1969. I wrote the software for the first node connected to the ARPANET at UCLA, and then we came here in 1974 to demonstrate that. And it happened that that was also the year that the first paper describing the internet was published. And so we are going to celebrate next year the 40th anniversary of the design of the internet. And this year, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the operation of the internet because it was turned on January 1st, 1983. So this has been around for a long time, and it's wonderful to see Africa waking up to this technology and its potential. All right, some rapid-fire points. First, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of wealth and growth. But what's critical is that they are owned by the people in the country. So it's wonderful for countries to have arrangements to invite other companies to come in and set up businesses and operations, but real wealth comes from ownership, and ownership comes from the people who are running small and medium-sized enterprises. Second, I want to point out that in addition to the venture capital contribution to GDP, that government research is also a very important element. At least in the United States, I can tell you that the funding for the ARPANET and the internet came from the American Defense Department. It was augmented by the National Science Foundation. They funded the operation and development and evolution of that system from 1969 until 1995. And so it's a very, very long period of funding. Not huge amounts of money, although at some points, tens to 20s to $30 million. But the idea here is it was long-term, high-risk funding. It was okay to have failures. This is something that we just learned from Evan, that failure is not a mark on your forehead, it's a mark of experience. And he's taken advantage of that and brought his most recent company nearly into balance. So that's important that the government can also participate in this by helping to get risky research done and then move it close enough to the point where a venture capital company is willing to assume the remaining risk in order to invest in it. That's important. With regard to internet, an open internet is really important. The idea that anyone with a good idea can put that system up on the network and try it out without having to get permission from every ISP in the world is fundamental to the way in which the internet has created a growing economy. So you hear these terms, net neutrality and other things. The only point I want to make here is that the people who are operating the underlying transmission system of the internet shouldn't be able to abuse that to control and inhibit competition and the application of new inventions. This permissionless innovation is at the heart of the internet's evolution. The third or fourth point here, I'm losing track. The notion of sharing spectrum, something that Minister and I discussed earlier this morning, is really important. Technically, we are not making good use of radio spectrum right now. If you look at the heart of packet switching, which is how the internet works, it's sharing of common bandwidth by a large number of people who are generating small little packets of data, and they all race down these high-speed fibers and they share it. It's like having lots of cars on the highway instead of having a dedicated bicycle path where only one bicycle is on from Cape Town to Johannesburg. We want sharing of the capacity. We have all kinds of technical means to do that, but we aren't allowed to do it because of regulatory restraints. So, Minister, again, we're thinking the regulatory situation needs to be re-examined, not only from the business point of view, but also from the technical point of view. Having infrastructure in place has a dramatic enabling effect. Not only does it create platforms for people to develop new products and applications, but it may also be essential for education. And in the US, we've experienced something called MOOC, which stands for Massive Open Online Classes. My two colleagues at Google decided to teach a class in artificial intelligence at Stanford last year, and they thought maybe 500 people would sign up. Some of you have heard this story. 160,000 people signed up for the class because it was offered through the internet. And of course, there was a mad scramble to redo the software. Since that time, some classes have got to the size of 350,000 people. Now, who do you think is excited about that? You imagine the universities would run away, right? And think, well, this is a competition. The strongest proponent for MOOCs that I know is John Hennessy, the president of Stanford University. And I asked him, why do you like this? I mean, you have these $50,000 a year tuition and everything else. And he says, let me explain the economics. Let's do the math. Suppose that you have 100,000 people in the class, not an unusual potential. Suppose they each paid 10 pounds or 10 euros or 10 rands or something. That's a million rand class. How many professors do you know have taught million rand classes? So you can do a lot with that amount of money. You can pay teaching assistants. You can have people who are online assisting the students. What you do is you do videos and you put them up and the students can see them as many times as they want, whereas your lecture they only hear once. Then when they get into the class, they solve problems. They just discovered why they were learning that stuff. So MOOCs, very important notion, great economics. Mobiles, another major platform. This entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have been talking about all morning has lots of pieces to it. It's not just about money. It's about having a source of skilled labor, not just technical labor, but people that know marketing and sales and business and finance and management, in addition to something fundamental and technical. That whole ecosystem has to work. And when pieces of it are not working, the engine doesn't run. Okay, one last point I guess I should make about infrastructure. Some of you know probably that Australia has decided to pay for a fiber infrastructure to everyone's residence and office building as a future investment in the infrastructure of the country. It's a huge experiment, very important one to watch. Not every country needs necessarily to copy that kind of experiment, but what I think is important is it shows the value of having a broad and far-reaching infrastructure. Here in this part of the world, the mobiles are actually serving that function, and they can be a stepping stone into a broader kind of capacity when the economics of all that make sense. I guess the one last thing, I apologize for doing this to you. She had a set of questions to ask. But I'm the chief evangelist, and that's what I do. I preach sermons, and you're getting one. The last little bit of this sermon has to do with how you get into internet business and where you market to. Internet is global in scope, and that point has been made more than once. The reason that's important is that even if you have a relatively immature domestic infrastructure, there's nothing stopping you from marketing to other places in the world that have a rich and penetrating use of internet. And so it's absolutely okay to get into business and market to those other parts of the world. In fact, anyone who believes that they can create a powerful business on a purely domestic basis when they're thinking about internet is looking at it the wrong way. The world is your market. Now, plainly, you have to think very hard about how to market to different parts of the world. You have market segmentation like you do everywhere else. But don't get stuck thinking that you only have to deal with the domestic market. You absolutely have an opportunity to reach further out. Okay, I'll shut up there. Happy to answer questions, and thank you all, by the way, for coming and letting me take some of your time.
Well, I'd like to actually start with your title. I've never heard of a chief internet evangelist. What is an internet evangelist?
So, when I joined Google in 2005, they said, "What title do you want?" And I said, "How about Archduke?" And they stopped for a minute and they said, "Well, that doesn't fit into our HR structure very well." And then Larry and Eric and Sergey came back and they said, "Do you know that the last Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914 and it started World War I. Maybe that's not a good title to have." Then they said, "Considering what you've been doing for the last 35 years, why don't you be our chief internet evangelist?" I said, "Okay, I can do that." The honest answer is it's whatever seems to be needed at the time. But a lot of my time is spent on policy. A lot of my time is spent trying to find ways to help stimulate the creation of more infrastructure that can support internet and its operation. A lot of my time is spent responding to people saying, "I've just patented something, would you like to license it? Would you like to buy my company? Can I come and work for Google?" And part of my problem, and I've just invented something new. Part of my time is spent finding the right person at Google to pass some of these ideas along to, because we've grown from 2 people in 1998 to 40,000 people in 2013. By the way, we just had our 15th birthday party yesterday on September 4th.
Oh,
so we're now 15 years old.
Happy birthday. When you take us back, when you think back to those first networked computers and then you come to today and look at the current system as it is today, how much did you anticipate and how much of it is it a surprise for you?
So, the honest answer, of course, would be to say, well, we didn't imagine any of this, but that's not true. You need to understand a little bit of history and timing. The ARPANET project was an experiment to see whether packet switching would work. You can think of these packets as like electronic postcards because they behave just like a postcard, except they're 100 million times faster. So we experimented with it and built a successful network based on this packet switching idea. During that time, from 1969 to 1973, electronic mail was invented in 1971. And it was a big instant hit. And you could see immediately the social impact of this. I mean, it's like letter writing, but it's a deferred communication. So before that, if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to make a phone call, you both had to be awake at the same time. So there's a time zone problem associated with that. But in the case of email, you could send an email and somebody else would read it later and then respond, and it would go back and forth, like postal mail, but faster. So the first thing that happened after we got the email up and running is somebody started a distribution list. Guess what the first distribution list was? This is for sharing information. It was called Sci-Fi Lovers, science fiction lovers, because we're all geeks, right? That's all we ever read is science fiction. So that was the first thing. The second one was called Yum Yum. It was a restaurant evaluation distribution list for restaurants in the Palo Alto area near Stanford. Those were 2 obvious social networking activities at the very earliest stages of email. So it was very clear that something was going on with this technology that had a social element to it. The second most important thing that we knew about and used was a system called NLS, which stood for Online System. The man that invented this is Douglas Engelbart. He passed away a few weeks ago. He's the guy that invented the mouse, but he also invented, for all practical purposes, a World Wide Web in one computer. It had hyperlinking capabilities. Every document had its own unique identifier. You could click on the identifier on the screen, and it would take you to the document that was referencing. It was all in one big time-sharing machine. It had all kinds of other very interesting properties to it. We used that system on the ARPANET and later on the internet for documenting a lot of what we were doing. So we had knowledge workers creating content and sharing it with each other. We saw that in operation before we started the design of the internet. We had the success of the packet switching in the ARPANET. So Bob Kahn, my partner in doing this work, went from Bolt, Beranek, and Newman that built the ARPANET for the Defense Department, went to ARPA to manage a bunch of programs. And one of the things he decided to do was to say, well, if this packet switching works on wireline, maybe it'll work in mobile radio. Maybe it'll work on a shared satellite channel. So we designed and built, or caused to be designed and built, a mobile packet radio system and a multi-station satellite system in the 1970s. And our purpose was to see whether we could make mobile communications work. Ships at sea needed the satellite capability and ground mobile. Remember, this is military funding. Well, around the spring of 1973, Bob comes out to my lab at Stanford University and he says, I have a problem. He says, what's the problem? He says, well, we've got this packet radio thing, and we've got this packet satellite thing, and we've got this ARPANET thing. And I don't understand how to connect them together so that it's transparent to all the machines on any of those networks. Yeah. That's the internet problem. So for 6 months, from the spring of 73 to the fall of 73, we worked on that problem and came up with a protocol called TCP, which later was expanded into TCP/IP. By 1974, we published a paper. During 1974, my team at Stanford detailed the design of TCP protocols. We started implementation in 1975. By 1977, we had a 3-network system functioning, and by 1983, we converted all the hosts on all the networks into internet operation with gateways between the networks. I know you didn't ask all that, but that's the thing I'm trying to explain to you is that we were focused on the problem. We were focused on the technology, but we were driven by the applications that were then in use. Guess what else we were doing in the mid-1970s? Packet voice and packet video. So all this stuff, this voice over IP and the things you do on your mobiles and all the Skype and all this other stuff, we were doing that back in the mid-1970s. We saw all of that. It's just that we didn't have enough bandwidth to do very much of it. But that stuff was the heart of the internet. And the whole point here is that it is it's an environment in which you can invent. Yeah. Because if you really get right down to it, what is the internet? It's really software. I mean, sure, it's a bunch of boxes and routers and wires and radios and everything else, but they just sit there and they don't do anything unless they're animated by software. Every single person you heard about today is successful because they are doing software. Yeah. Google is successful because it does software. It even gives software away in the form of Android operating system and the Chrome browser and the Chrome OS operating system. We give away platform access. People use Google Earth and Google Maps and all these other things in order to allow other people to take advantage of the platform and build on top of it. Yeah.
We talk a lot these days about government must stay out of this, let us do what we need to do. But at the start, where was government? How much involvement did they have in all of what you've just been sharing with us?
I'm sorry, they is government. Well, actually, government had a great deal to do with funding the research and the experimentation that led to these capabilities. The interesting thing is that it was not until 1988, and for me this is now 15 years into internet work. 1988 is the milestone for me where I wake up and realize, wait a minute, how do we get the rest of the population online? Because up until that time, no one was allowed to use the internet systems or any of the networks unless they had military funding or funding from the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy or NASA, government funding. So the government was paying for all of this. So I thought, okay, how do we break the back of that limitation? Now at that point, I was back working with my partner Bob Kahn at his company, CNRI. I had built something called MCI Mail for MCI in 1983. It's a commercial email service. And so I thought, okay, I can break the back of this policy that says no commercial traffic on the internet backbones if I can induce the government to let me put MCI Mail up on the net. So I went to the Federal Networking Council, which had policy responsibility for the internet in the US, and I said, could I connect MCI Mail up to the internet as an experiment? And they went away for a while, and they came back and said, well, okay, but only for a year. So we got busy. We built a gateway between the MCI Mail commercial network and the internet. We announced its operation in summer of 1989. And the instant that we announced it, every other commercial email provider said, wait a minute, those guys from MCI can't have this privileged position. We want to be connected to the internet too. And of course, the government had to say yes. So all of these other on-time and telemail and so on got all hooked up onto the internet. Then they discovered what they hadn't anticipated. Because they had to be compatible with the internet standards, suddenly all of these formerly disconnected email systems were interconnected with each other through the internet. Well, after that got going, 3 commercial internet service providers popped up in the US in 1989, and there was no stopping after that. The government allowed all this to happen. The backbone that the government built was used to show the private sector that there was a market for the service. They didn't have to build this backbone themselves to figure it out. They got to use the government investment. So the answer is the government had a lot to do with this. And in the US anyway, it has repeatedly, regularly, and with great determination pushed off all the policy activity into the private sector. There's almost nothing left now of any policy associated with the internet that the US government imposes.
Yeah. So now we've got these floodgates that are opened. Are there new technologies that excite you today?
Oh, we have no idea. Right now, the most exciting things for me have to do with the thing that came up earlier, sharing of spectrum, something that I believe we have not taken advantage of at all. 100 years ago, we had very poor quality receivers, and the result was that if anybody transmitted in any frequency, they overlapped, and you needed to have clear channel isolation. But now we have really, really good electronics. We have the ability and the theory to allow multiple simultaneous transmissions to occur in the same frequency bands, and you can separate out the transmitters. Code division multiple access, which is what Qualcomm sells, is based on that. Also a development that came out of DARPA. So that's one thing that I'm very excited about. The other things that I'm very interested in are alternative ways of delivering high-speed services to people around the world where there isn't much infrastructure at all. So Google has Project Loon, which many of you have heard about, putting balloons up in the stratosphere that are actually controlled by positioning them at altitude so they slip into different directions on the jet stream. And so we try to keep them, not necessarily stationary, but we keep them in the same latitude. Though eventually they will come circling around as long as we have permission to radiate at frequency in each country that they go over. So that's another policy issue that has to be dealt with. We also have a project, it's not our project, it's an investment that we made with a company called O3B, which stands for Other 3 Billion. This is a non-synchronous satellite system that's in orbit over the equator, but the satellites, of which there are 8 now and will be 12, are at 8,000 kilometers orbit, as opposed to 36,000, which is what a synchronous satellite would be. So the interesting thing is that they're closer, which means that there's better signal-to-noise ratio. We can actually deliver, or they can deliver 1 billion bits per second per spot beam, and there are 10 spot beams per satellite. So these things are looking 40 degrees north and south of the equator, delivering gigabit per second capacity, 10 gigabits per second aggregate capacity to the ground stations as they are circling overhead. So this is an opportunity to reach sub-Saharan Africa, to reach the Pacific Islands, to reach South America and parts of the north of the equator. That's another possibility. The other one, which gets me really excited, is a different way of looking at mobiles. There was a project that Nicholas Negroponte started when he was at the media laboratory called One Laptop Per Child. And although I don't think that worked out quite in the same way that he had hoped, one of the things he did really caught my attention. These devices had Wi-Fi in them, but you could take an aggregate of them and make them form a mesh network on their own. They would self-organize. So if one of them had good quality access to the internet, it could distribute that access to the rest of the devices if they were within radio earshot. Yeah. So the idea of having mesh networks that form in automatic ways and are self-managing is very attractive for kind of casual creation of networks where you wouldn't have any at all. I actually have something like this running in my house. I have it's actually a sensor network, which is keeping track of temperature, humidity, and light levels in every room in the house. And these are little radios that run on 2 AA cells for a year. They're using IP version 6, which is the new IP address space, or format, packet format, and they are a self-forming network. And so all the data that they collect goes through this little automatic network and goes into a server down in my basement. This is something only a geek would do. But the idea is at the end of the year, I have really good quality engineering information about how the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning actually worked. So now I can make adjustments based on real data as opposed to anecdotal reports. So I'm really excited about stuff like this.
Just press the up button and the down button.
Right, yes.
We've got time for some questions, and before we carry on with our discussions, we've got time for 2. Any burning questions?
Everybody's hungry.
There's one there. Okay, you know what? I'll make an exception. I'll make it 3. There's one there, there's one here, and there's one there. So let's start there. Ladies first.
Thank you very much. My name is Marcia Sotokwe from ICASA. I just wanted to find out, you haven't spoken in sufficient detail for me to understand on issue of spectrum sharing. Where are you going in terms of your thoughts technically on this?
Okay, so the whole idea here is that historically the way we have allocated and managed spectrum has been to dedicate it to a particular user. Even in the United States, there have been spectrum auctions acquired by one company, and then they use this auction to run they use the spectrum to run their business. No one else is allowed to radiate in that spectrum. What I'm going for is the possibility of allocating spectrum in a way that allows multiple parties to make use of that spectrum at the same time and use very sophisticated digital methods to allow these signals to be correctly distinguished so that anyone who wants to listen to a particular signal is not confused by the others that are in the same spectrum band. This gives much, much better quality use of the more dense use of the spectrum. To give you another geek response, if you go out into the wild, so to speak, well, your definition of wild is different from mine. I mean, in the urban environment, and you hold up a radiometer and ask who's using which part of the frequency, you discover that on the average, about 2% of the spectrum is active at any moment. This doesn't mean that only 2% of the allocated spectrum is ever used. That's not what I'm saying. It's all, somebody radiates in the allocated spectrum sometime. But at any moment, only about 2% is in use. If we do spectrum sharing, we could put much, much more application into the same spectral band and get much more use out of that capacity. And that's what I'm shooting for. It's a very different kind of technology and economics, and it's something we should be taking advantage of.
I hope that answers your question. There was one there. Just keep your hand up.
Thank you. I'm Walter from the South African Communications Forum. Vince, just one question, please. What's ever happened to the GNI and the clean slate redesign of the internet?
I'm sorry, did you hear
The first
The
part?
clean slate redesign of the internet and the GNI program.
The GNI program and the clean slate
Yeah.
Okay.
of the internet.
So let me take, Clean Slate was an idea that the National Science Foundation put forward, and it led to some very interesting software-defined network ideas. I'm a big fan, by the way, of stepping back and saying, if I had to do this all over again, how would I do it and what would I make differently? So the clean slate idea was a very refreshing kind of approach. In the end, what happened is, at least in one instance, is that something called open flow was developed at Stanford University and then turned into a commercial operation. We adopted the open flow technology at Google, literally jacked up all of the data centers and connected them together using the new open flow technology, which gave us much better control over the use of the capacity, much more efficient use of the capacity, so that we could get more than 95% of the available capacity actually in use rather than the more classic 2/3. So from the clean slate point of view, this was a very successful enterprise. Bob Kahn and I both believe that if you do these clean slate exercises, you can often discover that, then you say, here's how I would do it differently. Then you ask yourself, can I retrofit this into the existing internet? And often the answer is yes. So for security, for example, there are a lot of things that are being retrofitted now into the internet environment for the domain name system, for routing, for end-to-end cryptography, and also for strong two-factor authentication. Now, I didn't hear the first part of the question about, because I kept hearing
The G9.
G9. I don't know what G9 is, so I'm not helping you here. Wait, well, let's wait till we get
Let's
the
wait
microphone.
for the microphone, because I'm struggling here as well.
Sorry, there were two processes for redesigning the internet, the clean slate and the GENI.
GENI.
Oh, Genie. Oh, yes, okay. Actually, Genie was there. It's all part of the same program. Genie was a program that the National Science Foundation initiated to create an experimental platform on top of which clean slate ideas could be tested. And so the two are very linked. The clean slate program is on the top. Here are new ways of doing networking. And the Genie program was a physical infrastructure, a logical infrastructure that would allow experiments and tests to be done and measurements to be made. So those two things are actually progressing, and some things are coming out, like OpenFlow, and I expect there will be more in the future.
Okay, and there was one here. Could we have the microphone, please?
I've been instructed to stand up. Eh?
Don't look at me. Maybe I should say
Yes. It took so long to commercialize internet. From 60s actually up to 95 is when most of us came to use internet. If you did not take the idea of MCI, could we be here?
That's a really interesting question.
Yes, number one. Number two, are there other transformative research that is going on that would change the world? You don't have to say that is official secrets, but if you want to, you could.
Well, yeah, I can't share any Google secrets. I'm sorry. First of all, I think if the government had not done this funding, we probably wouldn't have the internet we have today. All the traditional wisdom said the way you're supposed to do networking is circuit switching. And this was considered crazy in the 1960s, but we did it anyway. And we even asked AT&T if they wanted to participate in the ARPANET experiment, and they said, no, it won't work, but we'll be happy to sell you dedicated circuits so you can try out your stupid idea. And we said, fine, we'll take your dedicated circuits and we'll build our stupid idea, and guess what? It worked. In terms of what's coming next, I think probably two of the most important things that I see right now are neuroelectronics, that is to say, interconnecting computer-based things or electronic-based things with our neural systems. I have a personal story about that, which I'd like to share. My wife has lost her hearing when she was 3 years old. See, she had normal hearing, she gained speech, but then she had spinal meningitis, and the meningitis had a very high temperature, and it destroyed the little ciliary hairs that are inside the cochlea. And so even though the auditory nerve was there, there were no ciliary hairs to move to resonate with sound that's driven by the eardrum. So she became profoundly deaf, and for 50 years, she had to survive by reading people's lips. Then one day on the internet, she started to look into cochlear implants. Now, the way these things work is that it's a wire with about 16 to 20 electrodes is pushed inside the cochlea. It's like a little snail shell. And you push this wire inside, but the electrodes are touching the auditory nerve, and there's some electronics associated with that. That's all embedded inside the head. It takes about 45 minutes to do that operation. It's an outpatient operation to insert the electronics. Then you go home for 2 or 3 weeks while everything heals. So she had this operation in 1996. She went home all the operation healed. She went back to be activated. What that meant is that she got a speech processor about the size of a mobile phone. Its job was to use a microphone to listen to sound, to analyze the contents of the sound by looking at what frequencies were present. We do this with what's called a Fourier transform. You know that. And the processor then figures out which of the electrodes that's touching the auditory nerve should be stimulated in order to tell the brain, this is what the frequencies are that I'm hearing at this amplitude. So basically, we know enough to fool the brain into thinking that the ear is working by artificially stimulating the auditory nerve. So she goes in, gets activated. 20 minutes after they turned this thing on, she picked up the phone and called me. We'd been married for 30 years, never able to use the phone. This was not...
Wow.
I get a little misty right about there. It'll take a minute to recover. Anyway, so of course, I get home. And what do I discover? I have a 50-year-old teenager. I can't get her off the telephone. She takes telemarketing calls. And she's very aggressive about every possible assistive device known to mankind. So first thing she does, she calls the library. And she says, I'd like to get recorded books for the blind, because she wanted to hear words that she knew but didn't know how they were pronounced. So remember, she's on the phone. Whoop, there goes the microphone. Is that working?
Yeah, it's clipped on.
Oh, you want to?
Let me just fix the tape maybe as well.
So much for the Scotch tape. Next time I'll tape it to my left nostril. I think it will work better. Okay, so anyway, she calls the library. Remember, she's on the phone. And they say, okay, can we have your name, your address, and your phone number? And she gave them all that. And then they said, now, you're blind, aren't you? And she said, no, I'm deaf. And there was this long pause. How's that going to work? Yeah. She listened to 500 books on tape. She got an FM transmitter and receiver, so in a situation like this, she would have the little FM transmitter hanging around your neck. She could sit anywhere 150 feet away and pick up the signal. She has a little cord with a microphone on that she can clip to the lapel. She has an infrared receiver, so when she goes to the movies, she can get the sound that way. She's been very aggressive about all this. Then in 2006, she had a second cochlear implant, so now both ears are working. Here's what happens when you have this situation. We raised our kids in this small little house in a place called Camelot in the Washington, D.C. area. And they grew up and went off to college and everything else. And then she got these implants. And then she reported to me that we needed a bigger house. Yeah. Everybody else is downsizing. We needed a bigger house because she wanted to have big parties because she could hear now. So we have a bigger house. All right, that's one part. The neural electronics is a big deal. The second thing that's happening, and you should just go Google this on the net because we don't have a lot of time left, there is an interplanetary extension of the internet which is now in operation. It's a project that got started the same year that Google was started, but it was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. My colleagues and I believed then and believe now that there should be rich networking available to support manned and robotic exploration of the solar system. And we needed a kind of network like internet. The trouble is TCP/IP didn't work when it had to deal with 40-minute round-trip delays, which is what you get when you go from Earth to Mars when we're farthest apart in our orbits. It's 20 minutes one way at the speed of light. So and there's this other problem. It's called planetary rotation. We haven't figured out how to stop that. So the problem is that there are things on the surface. There's things on the surface of the planet that you're trying to talk to, and the planet rotates, and you can't talk to them until it comes back around again. So this is variably delayed and disrupted communication. Yeah. We had to create a whole new series of protocols to do that. It's running now on Earth. It's running on Mars, on the rovers. It's running on the orbiters that are relaying information back to Earth. It's on board the International Space Station, and it's also on a spacecraft that's in orbit around the sun called Epoxy, which is rendezvoused with 2 comets in the last decade. So we're at the very beginnings of this expansion. It's being standardized, so every country that is developing space exploration vehicles, if they adopt the protocols, will make all these things interoperable. just like what happens when you plug into the internet and you can talk to 3 billion other devices because the standards are there. So that's what's happening in the future, and I'm really excited about it.
And as you said, we're out of time actually, but I need to ask you this one question. You heard from the innovators in the room the things that they're doing. You've heard also what the challenges are on the continent in South Africa. What advice would you give the innovators, the funders, and the regulators that are in the room?
All right, so on the regulatory side, we clearly need to open things up and make it easier for businesses to form. We have to accept the possibility that some businesses will fail, and that's okay. That's the normal course of events in the marketplace. It's not a mark that says that you should never get any money anymore. We have to make sure that there is a source of venture capital. There have to be a vibrant stock market to allow for IPOs, because when you need a lot of money, you need public support for that. I think that with regard to the regulatory situation for communications, radio spectrum and the like, I would like to see a lot more tolerance of and even invitation to experiment, to explore new ways of using the spectrum than we have today. On the entrepreneurial side, I love what I saw today. I mean, this is really good stuff. These are people with clever ideas who could pursue them because there is an ecosystem that will support them. And in South Africa, it's clear we need to do some things to make that ecosystem better. I think that on the educational side, we also have to do more than teach people how to use applications. This is a problem in the US too. It's not unique to South Africa. I want every kid to have the experience of writing a piece of software and discovering what a bug is and how hard it is to find and fix before they graduate from high school. It's not that I want them all to be programmers, but they're going to be surrounded by software in the rest of their lives, and I want them to understand its frailties as well as its power. And that you only get from trying things out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.